Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The information presented in this video regarding historical legal records, divorce proceedings, and archival research is for educational and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice, professional genealogical services, or official legal counsel. Historical laws and the availability of records vary significantly by jurisdiction and time period. Viewers should conduct their own due diligence and consult with licensed legal professionals or certified archivists when dealing with modern legal matters or sensitive historical data. In the year 1785, if you were living in the burgeoning urban center of New York City and your marriage had become a living nightmare, you couldn't simply walk into a storefront office and file for a no-fault dissolution. In fact, for many, the only path to freedom was a literal act of the state legislature, a process so expensive, so public, and so grueling that it was reserved almost exclusively for the elite. We are often fed a sanitized, hallmark version of early American history where families were stable, marriages were permanent, and divorce was a modern invention of the 20th century. But that is a historical fiction. The reality hidden within the dusty, iron-gall ink-stained ledgers of our earliest urban centers is far more scandalous, far more litigious, and infinitely more human. There is a common misconception that our ancestors just endured. The data tells a different story. In the transition from colonial outposts to teeming metropolitan hubs, the early United States became a laboratory for the dissolution of the domestic bond. If you think the divorce mill started in 1950s Reno, you are about 150 years off the mark. This deep dive solves a massive problem for researchers, historians, and anyone tracing a family tree that seems to hit a brick wall in the early 1800s. Often, when an ancestor disappears from the records in a city like Philadelphia, Boston, or Charleston, we assume they died in an epidemic or migrated west. Frequently, however, they were navigating the complex, labyrinthine legal systems of early urban divorce. By the end of this masterclass series, you will understand exactly how to navigate the shift from legislative to judicial divorce, how to interpret the brutal language of libels and petitions, and where to find the untapped data caches that reveal the potential outcomes of these historical domestic battles. We are moving beyond the surface-level names and dates to uncover the raw, unfiltered testimony of a society in flux. To understand how to compile these records today, we first have to deconstruct the urban pressure cooker effect of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In rural agrarian communities, a failing marriage was managed by the community or the church. There was nowhere to hide. But as cities like New York and Philadelphia began to swell, the anonymity of the urban crowd provided a new, albeit risky, social mobility. This anonymity led to the first major trend in historical divorce records: the rise of desertion cases. In the early federal period, the most common divorce wasn't a legal one at all. It was self-divorce, where a spouse simply walked out into the city streets and never returned. However, for those who stayed and fought, the records they left behind are some of the most descriptive documents in the American archive. When we look at early urban centers, we are looking at two distinct types of records. The first is the legislative petition. Before the mid-19th century, many states required an individual to petition the state government directly. Imagine having to have a bill passed by the House and Senate just to end your marriage. These records are gold mines, because you had to prove to a body of politicians that your marriage was a failure. The petitions are incredibly detailed. They aren't just irreconcilable differences. They are 30-page narratives of extreme cruelty, intolerable severity, and gross neglect of duty. For example, in the Pennsylvania State Archives, you can find petitions from the 1790s where wives in Philadelphia detailed the exact hours their husbands spent in taverns and the specific names of the lewd women they associated with. This wasn't just gossip. It was a legal necessity to meet the high evidentiary bar of the time. As we move into the early 1800s, the burden shifted from the legislatures to the courts of chancery or the supreme courts of the respective states. This is where the case study approach becomes vital for the modern researcher. Take the New York Court of Chancery records. This court dealt with equity, meaning it was less about rigid statutes and more about what was fair and moral. The records compiled here are often called libels for divorce. In this context, a libel isn't a published lie. It is the formal legal document stating the grounds for the suit. If you are searching these records today, you are looking for depositions. In an era before digital recordings or even widespread shorthand, clerks wrote down every word of witness testimony. You will find transcripts of neighbors who peeked through windows, servants who overheard arguments through floorboards, and physicians who testified to physical abuse. These urban centers were dense. People lived on top of each other, and that density means the volume of witnesses in an urban divorce record is significantly higher than in a rural one. The data shows a fascinating historical trend regarding gender in these early urban records. While the law was heavily weighted in favor of men regarding property, women in urban centers were the primary filers for divorce in many jurisdictions. In the city of Boston between 1760 and 1789, women filed more than double the number of petitions compared to men. Why? Because in an urban environment, a woman had a slightly higher potential outcome of finding wage labor or community support than she did on a secluded farm. When you are compiling these records, you must look for the alimony rolls and dower rights records. Even if a divorce wasn't fully granted, the court might grant a divorce amensa thura, or a divorce from bed and board. This was a legal separation. The records for these are often filed under maintenance or support rather than divorce, which is a common pitfall for researchers. Step 1 in your research process for these early urban centers is identifying the specific court hierarchy of the era. For example, if you are looking at early 19th century Baltimore, you aren't looking for a family court. That didn't exist. You are looking for the High Court of Chancery of Maryland. If you are looking at Charleston, South Carolina, you are navigating a state that famously almost never granted absolute divorces until after the Civil War, forcing residents to seek separate maintenance files. This geographical variance is why we call this a masterclass. You cannot apply a New England research strategy to a southern urban center. To add even more value to your search, you must look into the protonotary records. The protonotary was the chief clerk of the court. Their ledgers often contain the appearance dockets. Sometimes the full case file for a divorce has been lost to fire, water damage, or poor archiving. However, the appearance docket, the summary of when the parties showed up and what motions were filed, often survives. These dockets provide a chronological map of the breakdown of a marriage. You can see the date of the initial subpoena, issued to the wayward spouse, the answer filed by the defendant, which is often a fascinating counterattack, and the final decree. Even a one-line entry in a protonotary ledger can confirm a divorce that was previously thought to be a legend in your family history. In Part 2, we will go even deeper into the specific terminology used in these urban dockets. We will look at how femme sole status changed the game for urban women, and why the notice of publication in early newspapers is your best friend when the official court records are missing. We are just scratching the surface of the paper trail left by the thousands of early Americans who decided that forever was a bit too long. The archives are waiting, and the stories they hold are far more complex than any textbook would lead you to believe. We are moving from the what to the how, ensuring you have the tools to navigate these records with the precision of a professional historian. To understand the actual mechanics of compiling these records, we have to look past the modern definition of divorce and enter the world of legal fictions and social workarounds. In 2026, you might find yourself sitting at a high-speed terminal in a state archive, but the documents you are scrolling through were written in an era where the legal identity of a woman was almost entirely subsumed by her husband. This brings us to our first major historical trend and a vital tool for your research: the femme sole trader petition. Imagine if you are a researcher named Marcus, working in Philadelphia in 2026. You are looking for an ancestor named Mary who seems to have been living independently in 1815, even though her husband, Thomas, is still listed in the city directory 3 blocks away. Mary hasn't filed for a divorce because in 1815, a full divorce or a divorce of vinculo matrimoniae was nearly impossible to get without proving extreme adultery or desertion to the point of absolute abandonment. Instead, Mary has filed a petition to be recognized as a femme sole trader. This was a specialized urban legal hack. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman could not sign contracts, sue in court, or own a business in her own name. However, in bustling mercantile centers like Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston, the economy needed women to be able to trade, especially if their husbands were sailors, drunkards, or simply absent. When you are compiling records, you must look for these petitions in the Court of Common Pleas, or the specialized mercantile court records. These are not labeled as divorce, but they represent a functional domestic dissolution. The records are often bundled in leather-bound volumes titled Petitions for Femme Sole Status. In these pages, you will find Mary testifying that Thomas has wasted his estate or failed to provide, and she is asking the court for the right to keep her own wages and manage her own shop. For a researcher, this is a goldmine of data because it provides a snapshot of the household's financial failure and the exact moment the domestic bond was severed in all but name. Now, let us move to the most public and often most visceral record of urban divorce in the early 1800s, the newspaper notice of publication. Before the digital age of 2026, the local newspaper was the internet of the early American city. When a spouse left, the remaining spouse would often place an ad in a paper like the New York Gazette or the Boston Evening Post. These were known as absconding ads. Imagine if you found a notice from 1805 that reads, "Whereas my wife Sarah has left my bed and board without provocation, I hereby warn all persons against trusting her on my account, as I will pay no debts of her contracting." This was a critical legal step. By publishing this notice, the husband was publicly terminating his financial responsibility under coverture. These notices are essential case studies in the breakdown of urban marriages. To find them, you need to use digital newspaper repositories and search for terms like bed and board or credit or eloped. In the context of the early 19th century, elope did not mean running away to get married. It meant a wife had run away from her husband. These records are often the only evidence of a separation for the working class. While the elite were fighting in the high courts, the average urban dweller was airing their dirty laundry in the classified ads. This data allows us to track historical trends in urban mobility. You will often see a spike in these notices following economic panics or yellow fever outbreaks, as the stress of urban life pushed marriages to the breaking point. Step by step, when you find one of these notices, your next move is to correlate the date with the local tax assessment rolls. In a city like New York, if the notice appears in 1810, you should check the 1811 tax records to see if the wife has appeared as a head of household or if the husband has moved to a boarding house. This cross-referencing is how you build a comprehensive profile of an urban divorce that never made it to a formal courtroom. However, for those cases that did reach the judiciary, you need to understand the anatomy of a court of chancery file. This is where the deep dive into physical records becomes most intense. A complete file from an early urban center usually contains 4 key documents. First is the libel or petition. This is the plaintiff's opening salvo. It details the marriage date, the birth of children, and the specific grievances. Second is the answer. This is the defendant's chance to fire back. In many cases, the husband would claim the wife was actually the aggressor, or that she had an intemperate disposition. Third, and most importantly for the researcher, are the interrogatories and depositions. Because the Court of Chancery operated on written testimony, they sent out lists of questions to witnesses. You will find pages of testimony from neighbors, tavern keepers, and even the couple's children. Finally, there is the decree. This is the judge's final ruling. As we move toward the 1830s, we see a massive shift in how these records were compiled. This was the era of the Great Divorce Reform. Urban centers were becoming overwhelmed with petitions, and states began to pass laws that moved the power of divorce from the state legislatures to the local county courts. This is a critical transition for you to track. If your ancestor lived in Philadelphia in 1820, their divorce might be in the state legislative records in Harrisburg. But if they lived there in 1840, it is almost certainly in the local county protonotary's office. This shift democratized divorce, making it accessible to the middle class, which in turn created a massive increase in the volume of records. Let us look at a specific case study from 1835. A woman named Elizabeth in Baltimore filed for divorce on the grounds of intolerable cruelty. In the records of the Baltimore County Court, we can see the step-by-step escalation. We find the initial subpoena served to her husband, the testimony of a local physician who described the marks of violence, and the testimony of a neighbor who heard the shouting through the thin walls of their row house. This level of detail is unique to the urban environment. In a rural setting, a neighbor might live a mile away and see nothing. In the city, the intimacy of the crowd meant that every domestic dispute had an audience. To add even more value to your research in 2026, you must also look for the collateral records of divorce. The apprenticeship indentures. Often, when an urban marriage failed and a formal divorce wasn't possible or affordable, the children were the first to be impacted. In the records of the overseers of the poor, you might find an entry for a child being apprenticed out because the father has deserted and the mother is unable to provide. These records often explicitly state the reason for the father's absence, providing a backdoor into a divorce story that has no formal court file. The complexity of these records is a testament to the resilience and the desperation of people living in the early American city. They navigated a system that was designed to keep them together, using every legal loophole and public notice available to find a path toward independence. But what happens when the records aren't in the courthouse or the newspaper? What happens when the trail goes cold because the participants intentionally obscured their tracks? In the next part, we are going to look at the darker side of urban dissolution, the world of bigamy and aliases. We will explore how people in cities like New Orleans and New York simply reinvented themselves to escape a marriage, and the specific techniques you can use to unmask these hidden lives using census data and city directories. We will also dive into the scandalous world of the early private investigators, the men hired to spy on spouses in the 1840s, and the reports they left behind that still exist in private archival collections today. The hunt for the truth is about to get much more difficult. The challenge of tracking a domestic dissolution in an early American city often boils down to a single frustrating reality: the intentional disappearance. In the year 2026, researcher Marcus is sitting in front of a high-resolution terminal at the National Archives, attempting to solve a mystery from 1842. He is looking for a man named Silas who lived in New York City. In 1840, Silas is listed in the census with a wife and 4 children. By 1845, Silas is gone. There is no death record, no probate file, and no formal divorce decree in the Chancery Court. For a novice, this is the end of the line. But for a professional compiling these records, this is where the investigative masterclass actually begins. In the mid-19th century, the anonymity of the urban sprawl provided the ultimate potential outcome for a failed marriage: the alias. This is the era of the urban ghost. To find Silas, Marcus has to stop looking for a divorce and start looking for a reinvention. In early urban centers, bigamy was not just a crime. It was a frequent historical trend used as a poor man's divorce. If you couldn't afford the legislative or judicial fees to legally sever a bond, you simply moved 3 wards over, changed your surname from Smith to Smythe, and started a new life. To unmask these individuals today, you must master the art of the city directory cross-reference. In 2026, we have the benefit of optical character recognition that allows us to search every iteration of a name, but the strategy remains the same as it was a century ago. You must look for the transition from a head of household listing to a boarding house listing. In the Longworth's New York Register from 1841, Silas might be listed at a specific street address with the occupation of carpenter. By 1843, if you see a woman named Martha listed at that same address with the designation widow of Silas, you have a data point. However, if you then search the 1844 directory and find a Silas at a different address, perhaps now listed as a shipwright, you have identified a potential bigamy or desertion case. The city directory was the first line of defense for the public. It was a forensic tool. You must pay attention to the abbreviations. The letter H usually stands for house, meaning the person owned or rented the entire structure. The letters BDS stand for boards. A sudden shift from H to BDS for a married man is a massive red flag in a divorce investigation. It signals that he has moved into a bachelor environment, often the first step in a permanent separation. Imagine if Marcus finds Silas in a different city entirely, like New Orleans. New Orleans presents a unique case study for the researcher because it operated under a different legal framework than the rest of the United States. While the North followed common law, New Orleans followed civil law, rooted in the Napoleonic Code. This meant that the records were kept with a level of bureaucratic precision that was rare for the time. In New Orleans, a divorce was often preceded by a formal inventory of the community. Because the law viewed marriage as a partnership of assets, the court would send a notary to the home to list every single item owned by the couple, down to the number of silver spoons and the condition of the bedsheets. If you are compiling records for a southern urban center, these notarial archives are your most descriptive resource. They provide a physical map of the broken home that no simple decree can match. But what if the spouse didn't just move? What if they were being watched? By the 1840s, we see the rise of the early private investigator, long before the famous agencies of the late 19th century took hold. In large cities, specialized watchmen and private agents were frequently hired by wealthy families to gather evidence of adultery, which was often the only ground for an absolute divorce. These reports, while not always part of the official court record, often survive in the private papers of law firms or in the personal correspondence of the families involved. These agents would track a spouse to oyster cellars, theaters, and boarding houses. When you are digging through archival collections, look for folders labeled Miscellaneous Legal or Correspondence Legal. You might find a handwritten report from 1846 detailing the exact movements of a wayward husband in Boston, providing the specific names of the witnesses who were later called to testify in the Supreme Judicial Court. Step by step, the process for unmasking an alias or a bigamous second marriage in 2026 involves a three-point verification system. First, you utilize the 1850 census, which was the first to list every individual in a household by name. This is a pivotal data set. If you suspect a divorce occurred between 1840 and 1850, the 1850 census allows you to see exactly who is living where and with whom. Second, you cross-check this with the mortality schedules. If a spouse claims to be a widow in a city directory, but they do not appear in the mortality schedules for that year, the potential outcome is that the widowhood is a social fiction designed to hide a desertion. Third, you examine the church records of the surrounding wards. Even when people abandon their legal obligations, they often maintain their religious ones. A man might move to a new ward in Philadelphia, change his name, and then attempt to marry a second wife in a different parish. By checking the marriage bans of various denominations in the same city, you can often find the same individual appearing under two different names within a 3-year window. Another high-value data source is the post office advertising list. In the early 19th century, if a letter was not picked up, the post office would publish the name of the intended recipient in the newspaper. For a researcher in 2026, these lists are a goldmine for tracking mobile spouses. If you see a name you are tracking appearing on the uncollected mail list in a city where they supposedly didn't live, you have found a geographical breadcrumb. This indicates they were likely in that city temporarily, perhaps scouting for a new location to settle under a new identity. The depth of these records reveals a society that was far more transient and less rigid than we often assume. People used the chaos of the urban environment to their advantage. They navigated the gaps between jurisdictions, the slowness of communication, and the limitations of record-keeping to forge new lives. But for the researcher, these gaps are also opportunities. Every time someone tried to hide, they left a trail of contradictions in the public record. By the 1850s, the push for more formal record-keeping began to close these gaps, leading to a surge in the very documents we rely on today. As we move forward in this deep dive, we have to address the one thing that truly drove these legal battles: the money. While the emotional toll of a failed marriage was significant, the legal records were primarily concerned with the division of property and the survival of the children. In the next part, we are going to look at the secret world of prenuptial agreements in the 1840s. Yes, they existed, and the brutal reality of the alimony dockets. We will explore how urban women use trust estates to protect their wealth from predatory husbands, and how the records of these trusts provide a hidden narrative of marital discord that never touched a divorce court. We will also look at the apprenticeship records in cities like Baltimore to see how the children of divorce were often the collateral damage in these urban domestic wars. The financial paper trail is often the loudest voice in the archive, and in Part 4 we are going to follow the money to its source. To follow the money to its source, we have to look into the shadows of property law, where the most revealing records of domestic failure are often hidden. Marcus, our researcher in 2026, is no longer just scrolling through court dockets. He is now diving deep into the county deed books and the records of the Court of Chancery. In the early 19th century, the financial destruction of a marriage was often documented long before the physical separation occurred. This brings us to a critical tool for your compilation: the separate estate or the trust deed. Under the prevailing historical trends of coverture, a woman's legal and financial existence was merged into her husband's. However, wealthy and middle-class families in urban centers like Charleston, Philadelphia, and New York found a loophole to protect family assets from a volatile or spendthrift son-in-law. This was the creation of a trust estate. Imagine a woman named Catherine in 1832 Charleston. Her father, wary of her husband's gambling debts in the city's many taverns, places her inheritance in a trust managed by her brother. When you are searching for records of a failing marriage today, you must look for these trust deeds in the land records or mortgage books. They often contain clauses that allow the wife to act as a femme sole regarding that specific property. If you see a sudden surge in trust activity or a husband signing away his rights to his wife's property, you have found the financial tremor before the earthquake of a divorce. Step by step, to find these in 2026, you should utilize the grantor and grantee indexes at the county level. Look for the wife's maiden name as a grantee and her husband or a male relative as a trustee. The language in these documents is incredibly specific. You will see phrases like "for her sole and separate use," "free from the control, debts, or engagements of her husband." These are not just legal boilerplate. They are defensive maneuvers in a Cold War at home. By mapping the dates of these trusts against the eventual filing for divorce, You can see the potential outcomes of a family's attempt to mitigate the financial fallout of a broken union. But what about the agreements made before the wedding? In the bustling mercantile atmosphere of early 19th century Boston, the antenuptial agreement, what we now call a prenup, was surprisingly common among the urban elite. Imagine if Sarah, a wealthy widow in 1845, decides to remarry. She has children from her first marriage and a significant portfolio of shipping stock. She signs a contract with her new husband, Henry, stating that he has no claim to her pre-existing wealth. These records are rarely in the divorce files. Instead, they are buried in the miscellaneous records of the county, or sometimes even in the probate records of the first husband. For a researcher in 2026, finding a Sarah and Henry who later appear in a divorce libel, these antenuptial contracts provide the exact inventory of the assets that were being fought over. They reveal the stakes of the divorce. Moving from the beginning of the marriage to its end, we must analyze the alimony dockets. In the 1830s and 40s, the Court of Chancery in states like New York or Maryland handled the gritty details of support payments. These records are often kept in separate volumes called Chancery Order Books or alimony journals. One of the most high-stakes documents you will find here is the Writ of Nexit Republica. This was essentially a 19th-century restraining order for the pocketbook. If a wife could prove to the court that her husband was planning to flee the state to avoid paying alimony, the court would issue this writ, which allowed the sheriff to arrest the husband until he provided a bond ensuring he would stay within the jurisdiction. In the records of the New York Court of Chancery, these writs often contain frantic testimony from neighbors who saw the husband packing his trunks or overheard him talking about moving to the Western Territories. The detail in these alimony cases is staggering. In 2026, Marcus might find a file for a case in 1838 Baltimore where the court ordered a husband to pay a specific sum. The file includes a forensic accounting of the husband's income, listing his properties, his bank stock, and even the value of his household furniture. This was done to determine the alimony amount. These records provide a more accurate picture of an ancestor's wealth than a census ever could, as every penny was being scrutinized by a hostile spouse and an inquisitive judge. However, the most heartbreaking financial records of urban divorce are found not in the high courts, but in the records of the overseers of the poor. In early American cities, when a father deserted or a divorce left a mother with no means of support, the children became the responsibility of the city. This led to the creation of the apprenticeship indentures. If you are tracking a family that seems to disintegrate in the 1820s, you must check the indenture books. These records list the child's name, their age, the master they were bound to, and crucially, the reason they were being apprenticed. You will often find the devastating phrase, "Child of John Doe, who has deserted his family," or "mother unable to provide due to the misconduct of the father." Let us look at a case study from Philadelphia in 1825. A woman named Margaret was left with 3 children after her husband fled the city following a failed business venture. In the records of the Guardians of the Poor, we find the entry for her 7-year-old son, James, being apprenticed to a blacksmith. The record explicitly details Margaret's testimony about her husband's abandonment. While James's indenture isn't a divorce decree, it is a legal record of the end of that family unit. To compile these today, you need to search for terms like binding out or pauper apprentices. These documents are often held in city archives or historical societies, and are a primary source for the social history of divorce. In 2026, we also have the advantage of digitized notarial records, especially for cities like New Orleans. As we touched on before, the inventory of the community was a mandatory part of the dissolution process under civil law. But the depth of these inventories goes far beyond property. They often include the valuations of enslaved people, business contracts, and even outstanding grocery bills. This provides a total snapshot of the urban household at the moment of collapse. If you are researching a divorce in early New Orleans, you aren't just looking for a legal case. You are looking for a complete audit of a life. Step by step, your compilation process should now involve: first, checking the Chancery or Equity Court for support orders and nexit writs. Second, scouring the land records for trust deeds and separate estate agreements. Third, investigating the records of the overseers of the poor for apprenticeship indentures of the children. Fourth, looking for the Syri facias records, a legal action used to revive a judgment, often seen when a husband stopped paying alimony years after the decree, and the wife had to sue him again. The financial paper trail of an early urban divorce is a map of desperation, strategy, and survival. It shows us how people leveraged every possible law to protect their future, when their domestic present was crumbling. But the legal and financial battle was only one part of the experience. Beyond the courtrooms and the counting houses, there was the court of public opinion and the power of the pulpit. In the next part, we are going to explore the social and religious records of divorce. We will dive into the church session minutes where marriages were tried before elders, the public shaming rituals of the early 19th century, and how a divorce could lead to a social death that was far more permanent than any legal decree. We will also look at the elusive records of the underground divorce networks, religious sects that allowed for the dissolution of marriage when the state would not. The narrative is moving from the ledger to the soul. The records only get more intense. The transition from the courthouse to the church house is where the historical researcher finds the raw moral friction of the early American city. In the year 2026, Marcus is no longer just looking at the dry, bureaucratic scripts of the Court of Chancery. He is now navigating the digital repositories of the Presbyterian Historical Society and the Quaker archives at Swarthmore. In the early 19th century, the state was only one of two major authorities governing domestic life. For many urban dwellers, the opinion of their congregation mattered more than the decree of a judge because the church controlled their social standing, their credit within the merchant community, and their very soul. When you are compiling records of divorce in early urban centers, you must prioritize church session minutes. In the Presbyterian tradition, the session was the governing body of a local congregation, consisting of the pastor and the elders. They held regular trials for members accused of unchristian conduct, which almost always included marital strife. Imagine a case from 1818 in a bustling ward of Philadelphia. A woman named Lydia has left her husband, a prominent clockmaker, citing his intemperance and his tendency to spend their household funds in the waterfront taverns. In the civil court, Lydia might have no standing because her husband has not committed a capital crime like murder or high treason. But in the church session minutes, the potential outcomes are very different. The elders would call witnesses, neighbors, fellow congregants, and even the tavern keeper to testify. These records are incredibly descriptive. Unlike the court files, which often stick to legal formulas, the session minutes record the actual dialogue. You will find entries where the husband is rebuked for his language, or where the wife is cautioned for her lack of submission. For the researcher in 2026, these minutes provide the psychological background of the divorce. To find them, you must first identify the exact ward where your ancestor lived, and then map the churches within a 6-block radius. In the dense urban environment of the early 1800s, people rarely traveled across the city for Sunday service. Once you have the church name, you search for the session records or the vestry minutes. Many of these have been digitized by denominational archives, but some remain in the basements of the original urban parishes, requiring a physical visit to the historical site. Step by step, when you are analyzing a church trial for divorce, you should look for the following progression. First is the citation. This is a formal summons for the parties to appear. If the husband refuses to show up, the church often views this as a confession of guilt. Second is the testimony. Pay close attention to the names of the witnesses. In urban environments, these are often the same people who appear in the city directories as neighbors or business partners. Third is the censure. This is the church's punishment. It could range from a private rebuke to a public excommunication. For a woman like Lydia, an excommunication of her husband was a functional social divorce. It signaled to the community that she was justified in her separation, allowing her to seek employment or board with relatives without being treated as an outcast. In the Society of Friends or Quakers, the process was even more rigorous. They were among the most prolific record keepers in urban centers like Philadelphia and Baltimore. When a marriage was in trouble, the monthly meeting would appoint a committee to visit the couple and attempt a reconciliation. The reports of these committees are stored in the men's monthly meeting or women's monthly meeting minutes. If reconciliation failed, the party at fault was disowned. In Quaker records, you are looking for the phrase disowned for outgoing in marriage or disowned for disorderly conduct. These records provide a precise date for the end of the domestic relationship, often years before any civil record might exist. But what about those who didn't just want a social separation, but a complete exit from the institution of marriage altogether? This brings us to the fascinating and often overlooked underground divorce networks of the 1830s and 40s. In large cities, radical religious sects like the Shakers or the early Perfectionists offered a sanctuary for those fleeing failed marriages. The Shakers, in particular, were active in the regions surrounding New York and Philadelphia. They practiced celibacy and communal living, which meant that joining the Shakers was a definitive, albeit religious, end to a marriage. When a spouse joined the Shakers, they often signed a covenant that effectively dissolved their prior domestic obligations. If your urban ancestor suddenly disappears from the city directory and reappears in a communal census or an admission ledger for a Shaker village, you have found a functional religious divorce. Case studies from the 1840s show a historical trend of women using these religious communities as a safe harbor. By joining a sect that rejected traditional marriage, a woman could escape an abusive husband and gain a level of autonomy that the civil courts refused to provide. The records for these transitions are found in the membership rolls and the apostasy records of these radical groups. To compile these in 2026, Marcus must look for the admission and withdrawal files. These often include the testimony of the individual explaining why they are leaving their worldly life, meaning their marriage, behind. Beyond the formal religious structures, there was the informal court of public opinion. In the early American city, social death was a very real consequence of divorce. This was documented through the use of broadsides and town crier reports. While rare, some urban centers maintained a record of public shaming. If a husband was found to have committed a particularly heinous act of desertion, the community might perform a shivaree, a loud public demonstration designed to shame the offender. While the noise itself isn't recorded, the resulting arrests for disturbing the peace in the mayor's court records often include the reason for the demonstration. This provides a backdoor into a divorce story that was too scandalous for the polite pages of the church minutes. To add even more value to your research, you must consider the potential outcomes of the petition of grace. This was a rare but documented practice where a divorced individual would petition their religious body for the right to remarry. These petitions often include a complete retelling of the first marriage's failure, often years after the fact. They are the 19th century equivalent of a retrospective. For a researcher, they are a second chance to find data that might have been lost in the initial conflict. The movement from the legal ledger to the religious soul shows us that the early American city was a place of constant moral negotiation. People didn't just accept their fate, they fought for their dignity in the eyes of their God and their neighbors. But even as the churches and the courts were deliberating, a third power was rising. The state legislatures were becoming the final battlegrounds for the most contentious and wealthy divorces in the nation. In the next part, we are going to dive into the legislative acts of divorce. We will explore the high-stakes world of the private act, where divorce was literally a matter of state law, and the secret divorce colonies that began to form on the edges of the growing American frontier. We will look at the massive files of the state legislatures in Harrisburg, Albany, and Richmond, and show you how to find the hidden testimony that never made it into the public newspapers. The scale of the battle is about to shift from the local ward to the state capitol. To find the records of a legislative divorce, you have to look beyond the local courthouse and set your sights on the state capitol. In 2026, our researcher Marcus is virtually digging through the digitized indexes of the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg. He is searching for a private act of the legislature. Before the mid-19th century, in many states, a divorce was not a judicial decree but a piece of legislation. It was a law passed specifically for two people. Imagine if every time a marriage failed, it required the same level of bureaucratic effort as naming a new highway or passing a state budget. This was the reality for the elite and the desperate in early urban centers like Philadelphia or Albany. The process began with a formal petition to the General Assembly. Because these were political bodies rather than judicial ones, the records they generated are entirely different from court dockets. When you are compiling these today, your first stop is the published session laws. These are the bound volumes containing every law passed during a specific legislative year. In the back of these volumes, you will find an index of private acts. You are looking for entries titled an act to dissolve the marriage contract of Julian and Clarissa Montgomery. The act itself is usually short, stating simply that the bonds of matrimony are hereby dissolved and the parties are restored to the rights of single persons. But the act is just the conclusion. The real data, the deep, unfiltered narrative, is buried in the legislative petitions. Step by step, to find this data in 2026, you must locate the original petition packet, often referred to by archivists as the record group for the General Assembly. These packets were often bundled together with red linen tape, which is where the term red tape originated. Inside, you will find the original handwritten request from the spouse. Imagine if Julian, a wealthy timber merchant in 1824 Philadelphia, wanted to divorce Clarissa. He wouldn't just state she was unfaithful. He would provide a dossier. Because he was asking a group of politicians to intervene in his private life, He had to prove that the case was so extraordinary that it couldn't be handled by existing laws. This led to the inclusion of character references from other prominent citizens. In these packets you will find letters from neighbors, business partners, and even local clergy, all testifying to the moral failings of the defendant. This brings us to a fascinating historical trend: the political nature of divorce. In the 1820s and 30s, whether or not you received a divorce often depended on who you knew in the legislature. Marcus, researching in 2026, discovers that Julian Montgomery was a frequent donor to the Whig Party. By cross-referencing Julian's political contributions with the legislative vote on his divorce bill, Marcus can see how the social and political networks of the city influence domestic outcomes. This is why you must also search the legislative journals. These journals record the day-to-day proceedings of the House and Senate. They show which committee handled the divorce bill, usually the Committee on the Judiciary or the Committee on Religion. The journal will tell you if the bill faced opposition, if it was tabled, or if it was sent back for more evidence. The potential outcomes for a legislative petition were often binary: total victory or total failure. There was rarely a middle ground. If the legislature rejected your petition, you were legally bound to your spouse with no further recourse until the next legislative session. This created a high-stakes environment that led to the first instances of what we now call forum shopping. If you lived in a state with a strict legislature, you might suddenly find a reason to move to a more liberal jurisdiction. This is where we see the emergence of early divorce colonies. Imagine a scenario where a resident of New York City in 1840 finds the state's adultery-only divorce laws too restrictive. They might take a steamship to Connecticut or a stagecoach to Indiana. Indiana, in particular, became a 19th-century version of a divorce mill due to its loose residency requirements and broad grounds for dissolution. When you are compiling records for an urban ancestor who seems to have disappeared, you must check the session laws of neighboring states. It was a common historical trend for people to establish a temporary residence in a different state just long enough to petition that legislature or local court. In 2026, you can search these multi-state records through consolidated databases like the Hathi Trust or the Internet Archive, searching for the specific names across all state session laws from 1830 to 1850. Another layer of data within these legislative files is the remonstrance. A remonstrance was a formal protest filed by the other spouse. If Clarissa Montgomery didn't want the divorce, she would file a counterpetition, arguing that Julian was the one at fault. These documents are often more revealing than the initial petition because they contain specific rebuttals. Clarissa might detail Julian's hidden assets or his own illicit affairs in the boarding houses of the city. For a researcher, the interplay between the petition and the remonstrance provides a 360-degree view of the marital collapse. To add even more value to your research, you must examine the specific language used in the final bill. Sometimes, the legislature would grant a divorce but include a prohibition against the guilty party remarrying. This was known as a collateral sanction. If you find an ancestor who never remarried after a legislative divorce, it might not have been out of devotion, but because the law literally forbade it. You will find these clauses at the end of the private act, often stated as, provided that nothing in this act shall be construed to allow the defendant to contract a second marriage during the lifetime of the plaintiff. As we look at the data from the 1840s, we see a massive spike in these legislative petitions, which eventually led to a systemic breakdown. Legislatures were spending so much time on divorce cases that they couldn't govern effectively. This pressure led to the constitutional reforms of the late 1840s and early 1850s, which stripped many legislatures of the power to grant private divorces and mandated that all cases be handled by the courts. This shift is a critical marker for your research. If you are looking for a divorce in 1845, check the legislature. If you are looking in 1855, check the county court. The records of the state capitol give us a glimpse into the intersection of private misery and public power. They show how the early American elite navigated the law to maintain their reputations while ending their marriages. But as the power shifted from the politicians to the judges, the nature of the evidence changed. The trials became more public, the testimony became more scandalous, and the media began to take notice. In the next part, we are going to look at the rise of the tabloid divorce. We will explore the mid-century explosion of the courtroom trial, the role of the early court reporters who turned domestic tragedies into public entertainment, and how you can find the actual trial transcripts that were sold as penny pamphlets on the streets of New York and Boston. We are moving from the closed committee rooms of the State House to the crowded, chaotic courtrooms of the 1850s, where every secret was for sale. The era of the high-profile urban scandal is about to begin, and the records it left behind are the most sensational in the entire archive. By the 1850s, the transition from legislative to judicial divorce was almost complete across the major urban centers of the East Coast. But this shift brought an unintended and explosive consequence: the birth of the tabloid divorce trial. In the year 2026, Marcus is no longer sifting through the dry two-page acts of the state assembly. Instead, he is sitting in front of a high-resolution scan of a 150-page trial pamphlet, a document that was originally sold for 12 cents on the street corners of Manhattan. To understand how to compile these records today, you must realize that in the mid-19th century, a divorce trial was the premier form of public entertainment. When the power to dissolve a marriage moved into the public courtrooms, it was met by the rising power of the penny press, newspapers like the New York Herald and the New York Sun that thrived on the visceral details of domestic collapse. Imagine if a high-stakes celebrity trial today was documented not just by cameras, but by thousands of stenographers recording every word for immediate mass distribution. This was the environment in 1850 New York and Philadelphia. One of the most significant historical trends of this era was the rise of the verbatim transcript. Before this period, clerks would summarize testimony, often sanitizing the more scandalous details. But as the public's appetite for these stories grew, court reporters began to use shorthand to capture the exact dialogue of the witnesses. For the researcher in 2026, this means the records from the 1850s are some of the most linguistically rich documents in American history. They preserve the slang, the accents, and the raw emotions of urban life in a way that census data or land deeds never could. Let us look at a vital case study: the Forrest divorce case of 1850 to 1852. Edwin Forrest was the most famous American actor of his day, a man of immense wealth and ego. When he sued his wife, Catherine, for divorce on the grounds of adultery, he expected a quick, quiet victory. Instead, Catherine countersued, alleging his own infidelities. The resulting trial lasted 6 weeks and became a national obsession. Marcus, searching in 2026, finds that the official court records in the New York County Clerk's office are only part of the story. Because the demand for news was so high, publishers compiled the daily newspaper reports into standalone books or pamphlets. To compile a complete record of a mid-century urban divorce, you must search library catalogs for terms like trial of, reported for the press, or testimony in the case of. These pamphlets are essential because they often include material that the official court record excluded: the atmosphere of the room, the reactions of the jury, and the cross-examination tactics of the lawyers. Step by step, to find these in 2026, you should utilize the American Antiquarian Society's digital collections or the Internet Archive. Search for the surname of the family followed by the word divorce or libel. What you are looking for is the forensic detail of urban surveillance. In the Forrest case, the testimony came from a carousel of witnesses: the servants who lived in the basement, the boarding housekeepers who kept the ledgers, and the stagehands who watched the wings of the theater. This highlights a crucial historical trend in urban divorce records: the death of privacy. In a city like New York in 1850, everyone was watching everyone else. The boarding house was the epicenter of this surveillance. In 2026, Marcus realizes that if an ancestor lived in a boarding house, their divorce record will likely contain the testimony of the landlord and the other tenants. Imagine a scenario where a husband is accused of adultery. In a rural setting, proving this would be difficult. In a Philadelphia boarding house, the walls were thin and the hallways were shared. The records will detail exactly who entered a room at 10 p.m. and who left at 4 a.m. This urban density created a specific type of evidence called the circumstantial trail. Lawyers would argue that while no one saw the act, the circumstances of being in a locked room with a person other than one's spouse was enough to meet the legal threshold. When you are compiling these records, look for the depositions of the chambermaids. They were often the star witnesses, testifying about the state of the bedsheets or the presence of specific items of clothing that didn't belong to the husband. This era also saw the potential outcomes of divorce become a weapon for social and financial destruction. Because a divorce for adultery in New York meant the guilty party could never remarry, the stakes were total. This led to the creation of the collateral record, the libel suit. Often, a divorce trial would spawn a dozen other legal battles. If a witness testified that a man was seen in an oyster cellar with a lewd woman, that man might sue the witness for libel. For the researcher in 2026, this means you cannot stop at the divorce file. You must check the civil litigation dockets for the years immediately following the divorce. These secondary trials often contain evidence that was suppressed or ignored in the primary divorce case, providing a much deeper understanding of the conflict. The data shows that by 1855, the volume of these judicial divorces in urban centers had tripled. This wasn't because people were more immoral. It was because the infrastructure for recording and publicizing the collapse of a marriage had become a profitable industry. In 2026, Marcus finds that many of these records were preserved not in state archives, but in the private collections of law firms that specialized in high society scandals. These collections, now often held by university libraries, contain the lawyer's notes, the unfiltered versions of the stories that even the newspapers wouldn't print. To find these, search for the names of prominent 19th-century divorce attorneys like John Van Buren or Charles O'Connor. Their papers are goldmines of domestic intelligence. To add even more value to your research, you must analyze the notice of appeal. In the 1850s, a divorce decree from a lower court was often just the beginning. The wealthy would appeal all the way to the state's highest court, the Court of Appeals. The records of these appeals are incredibly organized. They include the printed case on appeal, which is a bound volume containing every document from the lower court trial, all the motions, and the final judicial opinion. For a researcher in 2026, finding a case on appeal is like hitting the archival jackpot. It is a curated, indexed, and complete record of the entire legal war. However, as the mid-century progressed, the spectacle of the tabloid divorce began to have a chilling effect. The sheer public shame of these trials led to a new historical trend: the rise of the private referee. To avoid the prying eyes of the press, wealthy couples would petition the court to have their case heard by a court-appointed referee in a private office rather than a public courtroom. This was the birth of the sealed record. In 2026, Marcus discovers that many of the most scandalous urban divorces from 1860 onwards are marked as confidential or access restricted. This is a major hurdle for the modern compiler. You often have to prove a genealogical connection or a scholarly purpose to access these files. The move from the street corner pamphlet to the sealed chamber shows a society struggling to balance its obsession with scandal with its desire for Victorian respectability. But even when the courtrooms were closed, the consequences of divorce continued to ripple through the city. While the elite were sealing their records, the working class was still leaving a massive paper trail in the most desperate of places. In the next part, we are going to look at the paper trail of the displaced. We will explore the records of the Magdalene asylums, the House of Refuge, and the massive data sets of the municipal orphanages. We will see how a divorce in the 1850s could send a family spiraling into the world of institutionalization, and how you can find the names of the children lost in the system through the intake ledgers of the city's harshest charities. The story is shifting from the courtroom drama to the institutional reality of survival. The institutional reality of survival is where the paper trail of the urban poor finally becomes visible to the modern researcher. In the year 2026, Marcus is moving his investigation from the high society courtrooms of Manhattan to the austere, meticulously kept ledgers of the New York House of Refuge. When we talk about compiling records of divorce for the working class in early urban centers, we are rarely looking for the word divorce. Instead, we are looking for the word deserted. For a woman in 1852 whose husband had vanished into the anonymity of the city, there was no money for a lawyer and no social standing for a legislative petition. Her domestic dissolution was recorded not by a clerk of the court, but by the superintendent of an asylum or the matron of a charity. Imagine a 10-year-old boy named Samuel living in a cramped tenement in the Five Points district of New York. His father, a day laborer, walked out of the door 6 months ago and never returned. His mother, struggling to balance 12-hour shifts in a garment loft with the care of 4 children, is eventually forced to watch as Samuel is arrested for vagrancy or petty theft. When Samuel is processed into the House of Refuge, the intake officer doesn't just record his name. They record a comprehensive social history. In 2026, Marcus is looking at the digital scans of these original ledgers, and what he finds is a forensic map of a broken marriage. The entry for Samuel includes a column titled Habits of Parents. Here, the officer has written, "Father a drunkard, deserted family 2 years prior. Mother an industrious woman, but unable to govern." This is a primary legal record of a separation that exists nowhere else. Step by step, to find these records in 2026, you must target the case records of the managers. These are distinct from the basic intake lists. They are narrative histories. The House of Refuge in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston kept detailed biographies of their inmates. To find them, search for the record group of the Society for the Reformation of Juvenile Delinquents. When you open these files, you are looking for the parental history section. Because the reformers believed that delinquency was a product of a broken home, they were obsessed with documenting exactly how a marriage failed. You will find testimony from the mother explaining her husband's abandonment, providing dates, locations, and even the names of the people he allegedly ran off with. This data allows you to pinpoint the exact month a marriage ended, even without a formal decree. But the children were not the only ones institutionalized by divorce. We must look at the records of the Magdalene asylums and the houses of industry. In the mid-19th century, a woman without a husband in an urban center was a person without a legal category. If she was abandoned, she could not easily rent property or sign contracts. Many of these women sought refuge in religious institutions designed for fallen women. However, historical trends show that a significant percentage of the residents were not sex workers, but abandoned wives with nowhere else to go. The intake ledgers for the Philadelphia Magdalene Asylum, for instance, are deeply revealing. They often record the woman's previous residence and the circumstances of her husband's misconduct. In 2026, these records are often found in the archives of local historical societies, or within the special collections of university libraries. You are searching for the admission and discharge registers. Look for the column labeled Remarks, where the matron would often scrawl the reason for entry: left by husband for another woman or abandoned and left destitute. Another massive dataset is the almshouse record. The Philadelphia almshouse, known as Blockley, was a city within a city. When a family collapsed due to divorce or desertion, the almshouse was often the final destination. The daily occurrence books and the records of the guardians of the poor are your primary tools here. In 2026, Marcus utilizes the consolidated databases of municipal archives to search for the surnames of the families he is tracking. The almshouse records are unique because they often kept families together in the ledger, even if they were separated in the facility. You might see a mother and 3 children admitted on a Tuesday with the notation, "Husband John Doe in the city, but refuses to provide." This is a smoking gun for a domestic dissolution. It provides evidence of the husband's continued presence in the city, while documenting the legal and physical end of the household. To add even more value to this deep dive, we have to address the concept of the half-orphan. This is a term you will see constantly in the records of the 1840s and 50s. In the context of an urban orphanage, a half-orphan was a child with one living parent, usually the mother, who could no longer support them because the father had deserted. The intake ledgers of the New York Orphan Asylum, or the Boston Female Orphan Asylum, are filled with these cases. They often include the indenture of the child, but they also include the correspondence of the remaining parent. Marcus finds a letter from 1848 where a mother pleads with the orphanage to take her daughter because her husband has taken up with a theater troupe and left the state. This letter is a vital piece of the puzzle, providing the emotional and geographical context of the divorce that the formal court records lack. We must also confront the most harrowing institutional record of all, the insane asylum casebook. In an era where a husband had significant control over his wife's physical liberty, committing a spouse to an asylum was a potential outcome for a man wanting to avoid the scandal and expense of a public divorce. The records of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane or the Blackwell's Island Asylum in New York contain casebooks that detail the reason for a patient's commitment. In 2026, these records are highly sensitive and often require special permission to access, but they are invaluable. You will find cases where the admitting physician records that the woman's insanity is actually just a high-spiritedness or a refusal to obey her husband. The medical notes often track the husband's visits, or lack thereof, and his eventual request for the wife to be discharged once she has agreed to a quiet separation or a transfer of property. The strategy for compiling these institutional records in 2026 involves a 4-step verification process. First, identify the municipal institutions that existed in your target city during the decade of the family's disappearance. Second, search for the digitized intake and discharge ledgers, paying specific attention to the remarks and history columns. Cross-reference the names found in these ledgers with the city's tax and census records to see if the institution was the precursor to a permanent move out of the city. Fourth, look for the minutes of the board of managers for those institutions, as they often debated specific cases where a father or mother was attempting to reclaim a child after a period of separation. These institutional records remind us that for every high society divorce trial in the 1850s, there were hundreds of silent dissolutions happening in the shadows of the city's charities. The paper trail they left behind is a testament to the struggle of the urban working class to survive the collapse of the family unit. But as the 1850s drew to a close and the nation moved toward conflict, a new phenomenon began to emerge. The chaos of the city was no longer enough. People began to look to the horizon. In the next part, we are going to explore the Great Migration of the Discarded. We will look at how the burgeoning railroad system and the promise of the West became the ultimate divorce tool for the urban masses. We will track the records of the pioneers who weren't looking for gold, but for a clean slate, and how you can use the federal land records and the early territorial censuses to find the ancestors who used the frontier to bury their pasts. The urban deep dive is about to expand across the entire continent. By the mid-19th century, the urban pressure cooker of the East Coast had reached a breaking point, and for many, the ultimate potential outcome for a failed marriage was no longer a courtroom battle or a legislative petition. It was the horizon. In the year 2026, our researcher Marcus is no longer confined to the local archives of Philadelphia or Boston. He has pivoted his search to a massive continental data set, the records of the General Land Office. To compile records of divorce for the mobile American population, you have to understand that the frontier functioned as a massive continental-scale delete button for domestic obligations. This is what historians call the Great Migration of the Discarded. When you are tracking a spouse who seems to have vanished from an urban center in 1848, you aren't looking for a death certificate. You are looking for a land patent. Imagine a man named Benjamin living in a crowded tenement, Baltimore in 1845. He has a wife, 3 children, and a mounting pile of debt. The urban records show he was sued for maintenance in the local courts, but before a decree could be issued, he simply stopped appearing in the city directory. To a novice researcher, Benjamin is a dead end. But to a professional in 2026, Benjamin has just become a person of interest in the federal land records. The historical trend of this era was the GTT phenomenon, an acronym for Gone to Texas, though it applied to any territory where the federal government was selling or giving away land. In the anonymity of the West, Benjamin could present himself as a single man, a widower, or a bachelor, effectively divorcing his past without ever filing a single legal document in Maryland. Step by step, the process for unmasking this continental desertion in 2026 begins with the Bureau of Land Management's General Land Office Records website. Marcus starts by searching for Benjamin's full name across the public land states of the Midwest and the West. When he finds a match in the Illinois or Iowa territories, he doesn't just look at the final patent. He requests the land entry case file from the National Archives. These files are the goldmines of frontier divorce research. They contain the original application, and most importantly, the proof of improvements. To claim land under the Preemption Act of 1841 or the later Homestead Act, a claimant had to provide testimony that they had built a house and were living there with their family. Here is the forensic trick. If Benjamin is listed in the 1840 Baltimore census with a wife and children, but his 1852 Illinois land application identifies him as a single man or lists a completely different woman as his wife, you have identified a functional divorce through bigamy. The land entry case file often contains affidavits from neighbors in the new territory who swear they have known Benjamin for 3 years, and that he is a man of good character living with his family. By cross-referencing the ages of the children in the new household with the date Benjamin left Baltimore, Marcus can determine if this is a second illegal family. This is a common historical trend where the vastness of the American geography allowed for the creation of shadow lives that were never legally sanctioned, but were socially accepted because no one in a frontier town in Iowa knew the man's history in Maryland. But what about the wives left behind in the urban centers? Their records are often found in the bounty land warrant files. After the War of 1812 or the Mexican-American War, the federal government issued warrants for land to veterans or their widows. If a husband deserted to the West, the abandoned wife in New York or Philadelphia might petition the government for his bounty land as a form of alimony. In 2026, Marcus searches Record Group 15 at the National Archives, which contains the pension and bounty land files. These files often include the wife's testimony regarding the desertion, the marriage certificate from 20 years prior, and the statements of neighbors who confirm the husband has not been seen in the city for a decade. This is a vital piece of the compilation because it links the urban origin with the frontier destination. Another critical data set for this era is the territorial papers of the United States. Before a territory became a state, it was under federal jurisdiction, and the records of its courts and legislatures were often sent back to Washington, D.C. In these papers, Marcus finds that territories like Indiana or Utah had notoriously loose divorce laws compared to the strict East Coast. In the 1850s, Indiana became a premier divorce colony. To get a divorce in New York, you had to prove adultery, which was scandalous and difficult. In Indiana, you could get a divorce for almost any reason, including a vague clause known as the discretionary clause, which allowed a judge to grant a divorce for any reason they deemed proper. Imagine if a wealthy merchant from Boston traveled to Indiana, stayed just long enough to meet the residency requirement, and filed for a quiet divorce that would never be reported in the Boston papers. To find these in 2026, you must look at the local county court records in Indiana counties like Marion or Tippecanoe, where these divorce mills were most active. The records will show a high volume of plaintiffs who were born in New England, but are suddenly residents of a small town in the Midwest. This is a forensic signature of an urban divorce that has been exported to the frontier for the sake of privacy and ease. The 1850 and 1860 federal censuses are your final verification tools in this continental hunt. In 1850, for the first time, the census recorded the birth date of every individual. If Marcus finds his Benjamin in Illinois and sees that his birthplace is listed as Maryland, and his age matches the Baltimore records, the link is established. But then he looks at the children. If the oldest child was born in Maryland 10 years ago, but the younger children were born in Illinois starting 5 years ago, he has mapped the exact window of the desertion and the start of the new domestic unit. This is data-driven history that allows us to see the reality of American domestic life, behind the myths of the stable pioneer family. The potential outcomes for these individuals were varied. Some were eventually caught when they tried to claim an inheritance or a pension, leading to a late-life legal battle that generated a massive paper trail in the federal courts. Others lived out their lives in total anonymity, their urban pasts buried under the soil of their new homesteads. For the researcher in 2026, the goal is to bridge these two worlds. You are not just a genealogist. You are a forensic auditor of the American experience, moving between the dusty ledgers of the Atlantic coast and the expansive land records of the West. To add even more depth to your compilation, you must look at the records of the Western steamship and railroad companies. By the mid-1850s, the paper trail of migration included passenger lists and freight manifests. If a man was moving his entire household, he left a record. If he was moving alone with only a trunk, that too is a data point. These records, often found in the archives of companies like the Illinois Central Railroad or the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, provide the physical evidence of the departure. The story of urban divorce in the early United States is ultimately a story of movement. It is a story of people using the geography of a growing nation to solve the problems that the law could not. But as we reach the end of our masterclass, there is one final overarching record that brings every single thread we have discussed, the legal, the religious, the financial, and the geographical, into a single undeniable proof of a life. In the final part, we are going to look at the Civil War pension files. We will show you how the greatest tragedy in American history became the greatest archive for researchers, providing the final definitive word on thousands of urban divorces that were thought to be lost forever. We will see how the government's need for bureaucratic precision finally unmasked the secrets that people had spent decades trying to hide. The final revelation is just moments away. The Civil War pension files represent the ultimate forensic archive for anyone attempting to compile records of early American divorce, serving as the high-stakes climax of our masterclass. In the year 2026, Marcus is sitting in the research room of the National Archives, or more likely, navigating the massive digital infrastructure of the Fold 3 and Ancestry databases, specifically looking for record group 15. This is the moment where every disparate thread we have discussed, the urban desertions, the legislative hacks, the frontier reinventions, and the social shaming, is finally brought under the cold, bureaucratic light of the federal government. To understand why these records are so vital, you have to understand the historical trends of the late 19th century pension office. The government was not merely a source of financial support. It was the largest investigative agency in the world. Because the potential outcomes for a fraudulent claim involved massive federal debt, the pension office developed a system of verification that was more thorough than any local court. Imagine a scenario in 1885. A man named Robert, who served in a Massachusetts regiment, has died in a Chicago boarding house. Back in 1861, Robert had a wife and 2 children in a crowded ward of Boston. He enlisted, fought at Antietam, and then instead of returning to Boston, he drifted west, eventually settling in Chicago under a slightly different spelling of his name and marrying a second woman. He never filed for a legal divorce in Boston because it was too expensive and shameful. When Robert dies, both women, the Boston wife he deserted and the Chicago wife he lived with for 20 years, file for a widow's pension. This creates a collision of data that Marcus, researching in 2026, can use to reconstruct the entire domestic history of the family. The pension office did not just take a claimant's word for it. They triggered what was known as a special examination. If you find the word special examination on the jacket of a pension file, you have found the holy grail of divorce research. These examinations involved a federal agent, a special examiner, traveling to the urban centers where the soldier once lived. Step by step, the examiner would go to the original neighborhood in Boston, find the old tenement house, and interview the neighbors who lived there 25 years prior. The file will contain the verbatim depositions of these witnesses. They testify about the exact day Robert left, the rumors of his infidelity, and the struggles of the wife he left behind. The examiner then travels to Chicago and does the same, interviewing the second wife, her relatives, and her neighbors. The depth of this testimony is unparalleled. In a standard divorce decree, you get a paragraph of legal jargon. In a Civil War pension special examination, you get 50 to 100 pages of raw, unfiltered narrative. You find testimony from the soldier's old comrades who knew about his secret letters, the boarding housekeepers who remember him receiving mail from a mysterious woman in the East, and even the local physicians who treated the families. For a researcher in 2026, this is a masterclass in forensic reconstruction. You are seeing the human cost of the urban-to-frontier migration that we tracked in Part 9. When you are compiling these records, you must look for the circulars. These were printed forms the Pension Bureau sent to the soldier every few years, asking for a list of his living children and the name of his wife, including her maiden name and the date of their marriage. If a soldier was living a double life, you will see the contradictions in these forms over a 20-year period. In one year he might list his first wife, in the next he might claim he was a widower, and in the third he might list his new wife. These contradictions were the triggers for the investigations that generated the records we use today. To add even more value to your research, you must analyze the affidavits of service. Often, a discarded wife would hire a local lawyer to track her husband's service record to prove he was still alive, and therefore still liable for her support. These affidavits often include marriage certificates and baptismal records for the children, which the wife had to produce to prove her identity to the government. Sometimes, these are the only surviving copies of these urban church records, especially if the original parish church burned down or the records were lost in a city riot. Case studies from the 1890s show that the pension office was remarkably adept at finding the truth. They would cross-reference the soldier's enlistment papers, where he had to list his next of kin, with his later pension applications. If Marcus finds that Robert listed his sister in Boston as his next of kin in 1861, but listed a wife in Chicago in 1880, the examiner would immediately demand proof of the death or divorce of any prior wife. If no such record could be found, the pension was often denied to the second wife and granted to the first, legally validating the original marriage and documenting the desertion as a functional, if not legal, divorce. Another critical document within these files is the evidence of marriage form. Because many early urban marriages were common law or performed by itinerant ministers who didn't keep records, the pension office accepted witness testimony as proof of marriage. This means you will find depositions from the soldier's sisters, brothers, and old childhood friends, all recounting the details of a wedding that took place 40 years earlier. They describe the clothes the couple wore, the house where the ceremony was held, and the names of the guests. This provides a level of social detail that is missing from every other type of record we have discussed in this series. As we reach the conclusion of this masterclass, the final step in your compilation process in 2026 is the synthesis of the 10 records. You have the Legislative Act, the Chancery Decree, the Church Session Minutes, the City Directory Shift, the Femme Sole Trader Petition, the Newspaper Absconding Notice, the Land Patent Contradiction, the Institutional Intake Ledger, the Tabloid Trial Pamphlet, and finally the Civil War Pension Special Examination. When you lay these documents side by side, you are no longer looking at a name on a census page. You are looking at a three-dimensional human being navigating the most difficult social and legal challenges of their era. The historical trend we have uncovered is one of resilience and reinvention. Our ancestors used every gap in the law and every expansive mile of the American landscape to negotiate their freedom. The records they left behind are not just evidence of failure. They are evidence of the search for a better life. In 2026, with the tools of digital mapping and AI-assisted handwriting recognition, We have the potential outcomes of uncovering thousands of these stories that have been silent for over a century. But the story of the American domestic experience doesn't stop with the closing of the frontier or the end of the pension era. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, a new and even more complex system of surveillance and record-keeping began to take shape. The rise of the social worker, the professionalization of the family court, and the introduction of the birth certificate changed the game once again. In our next masterclass series, we are going to dive into the secret files of the progressive era. We will explore the records of the first domestic relations courts, the rise of the social case file, and the controversial world of the early 20th century eugenics records that attempted to categorize families based on their domestic stability. The hunt for the truth is moving into the modern age, and the stakes are higher than ever. Stay tuned for the first part of the next deep dive, where we unmask the origins of the modern family court.